This is the last message by Dr. Nedley for this camp meeting. And if some of you feel that you would like to get more information, he's not paying me to say this, but I would like to recommend that you go to the DVD outlet here on my right and get some of the DVDs, both of this weekend's messages and last weekend's. We have really had a lot of thought-provoking material given to us, and I know that you will be blessed by obtaining them. As far as I know, the DVDs are 18 Rand each, so they are affordable, especially considering how long the messages are. It's just, you get a lot of value for money. I want to take this opportunity, seeing that Dr. Nedley and Erica and Justin are flying out this evening, to say our thank you to them. We have really, as I mentioned, been stimulated by the presentations that have been given to us, and I know that many people who have been depressed will receive help and relief from these biblical principles that have been presented to us. And Dr. Nedley, I'd like you to come forward, please. I'd like to give you a small gift as a token of our appreciation for your ministry here in South Africa. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Pastor, very much. Should I open it up now or later?
You can open it later.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure being here in Africa, and particularly South Africa, and getting to know many of you. Unfortunately, our time is up, and as a result of that, one of my sadness aspects of things is I know that some of you still have burning questions that are personal in regards to health issues that you would like to see me about, and I just have run out of time, and so we do have to go to the airport afterwards. But I just wanted to alert you of that, because I've noticed after most of the presentations I give, there's quite a lineup, and I've always kind of teased other speakers at different camp meetings that when they're through speaking, often they're done. And when I'm through speaking, I've just begun. But we know that the healing ministry of Christ is indeed an important ministry, and one that not only helps and touches our own people, but is also an avenue of really reaching the world through the message of truth. And it is a privilege to be involved in the healing ministry of Christ. This final presentation, The Lost Art of Thinking, is basically based on the title of the book that is no longer available at the ABC. It is, we obviously did not bring enough, but we only had so much luggage space as well. But there is, the aspect of what I'm talking about here today is just one snippet of some of the information that is in the book. But someone reminded me at the last meal that I served that the book is actually available on iBooks or eBooks as well. It's actually available for even a less expensive price than the hard copy. So at least you know that it can be available that way. And I would assume that your ABC is going to be ordering some more as well as some of the other materials that can be useful for spreading the word to others, as well as learning more about it ourselves. One of the reasons why it's called a lost art is studies are showing that critical thinking is going down in the developed world. Even in America, a study was done a few years ago showing that 34 different prestigious universities, the highest level of accreditation that they can achieve in America, called regional accreditation, shows that about half of individuals that are able to complete degrees and do well in college, even at places like Harvard and Yale, when they get out, can still not sift fact from fiction. They still have the inability to do critical thinking under disciplined conditions. And it has become a lost art. And it's unfortunate. They, in doing their tests, they just kind of regurgitate back what the teacher says, but if they have to actually think for themselves in a new type of scenario and problem solve, it is now at an all-time low in America, and unfortunately it's going down further. And it's largely due to the cultural assault that has occurred on the frontal lobe of the brain, where this is the area where we do critical thinking. And by the way, the type of critical thinking they were asking them to do wasn't that complex. In fact, several generations ago, people graduating from high school in America could do those exercises over 90% of high school graduates. But now college graduates from the most prestigious accredited schools are not capable of doing that. And there's a whole book written on it by a secular individual, and he says, it's Richard Arum, if you want to look it up, A-R-U-M, but he states very clearly that our accreditation system is broken in education. And it needs fixed because we're not training people to be able to think for themselves. Now, thinking can actually change brain chemistry if we discipline ourselves to think true and accurate thoughts. What we think does indeed affect who we are. Many people in this world feel unfulfilled. And of course, some of those that feel the most unfulfilled end up coming to our program for depression and anxiety recovery that we now hold at Weimar. We also occasionally hold it at other places. But when I ask them about their unfulfillment, they'll often go to this: they're not smart enough, successful enough, attractive enough, or talented enough to feel happy and fulfilled. By the way, the attractive enough, that's an area that has dramatically exploded in the developed world. People will do all sorts of things to try to make themselves look more attractive. And they think somehow if they can look attractive enough, then they will be fulfilled. By the way, the plastic surgery industry has taken advantage of that. I know some plastic surgeons, they're friends of mine. But one group of plastic surgeons a few years ago decided to prove the statements that they were making to their patients. What statements were they making? If you undergo this surgery, you will look so much better, and as a result, you will feel so much better about yourself that your mental health problems will become far less prominent and probably just go away. And many people with mental health problems, of course, have what's called body image disorder as well. And so sometimes they're doing plastic surgery on things that actually look pretty fine already. But nonetheless, they thought, let's prove the myth. So the first thing that they did was, let's look at the end point. We know depression is a problem, and we know suicide is a problem in America. So let's take a look at individuals with depression who come to this plastic surgery clinic and decide to get the surgery or decide not to get the surgery after we explain it to them. And let's follow them for a few years and see what happens. And of course, the end point, the worst outcome of depression is what? suicide. So they said, okay, let's just look at the suicide rates. And the most common plastic surgery that was performed in America at the time, it probably still is the most common plastic surgery, but there are others competing for it at this point in time. Anyone want to guess what the most common plastic surgery is in America? Yeah, breast implants. Some of you have guessed it correctly. And so they followed them. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The suicide rates were significantly higher in one group. Which group do you think it was? The group that had undergone the surgery. Now, this was a group of 5 plastic surgeons doing a controlled study, and they thought this can't be right. In fact, it was very statistically significant that it appeared that the surgery actually worsened depression. And so they said, let's get a larger group. You know what happens when you don't have a very good study outcome? You think it's due to statistics. And so let's just get a much larger group. And so they got a whole state of plastic surgeons to come together to do a study on this. And guess what they found out? Precisely the same thing. Now, I don't believe that the surgery actually made their depression worse, but what happened is they had a false hope in something that was not the real problem causing their depression. It was the assumed problem. And when you have a false hope in something and then it doesn't work, guess what happens? You start having more feelings of hopelessness. And feelings of hopelessness is one of the best correlates of imminent suicidal action. So these things are actually not true. The reason why people are not fulfilled, or at least not completely and comprehensively true, is not because they're not smart enough, successful enough, attractive enough, or talented enough to feel happy and fulfilled, but that's what they're thinking. Now, even more common than this, they'll tell me that they're not fulfilled strictly due to what others have done to them, how others have raised them, how others have been treating them recently, and so their negative feelings are strictly due to others. And you know, there may be elements of truth about both of those bullet points. Bad things do happen and life beats up on most of us at times. However, all of these thoughts have the tendency to make us victims because we think the causes result from something beyond our control. All of these thoughts have the tendency to make us what? Victims. And by the way, the type of therapy that has been shown, it's the only type of therapy, by the way, that's been shown to be better than taking a placebo pill in helping depression, is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's several different versions of cognitive behavioral therapy out there, and they all do some significant good in these statistical studies. But cognitive behavioral therapy teaches this. In contrast, you can change the way you think about things, and you can also change your basic values and beliefs. And when you do, you will often experience lasting changes in your mood, outlook, and productivity. It turns out that our feelings, our emotions, and our behavior are caused by our thoughts. And our thoughts are something that we can actually change. Now, a lot of people, of course, have a little resistance to this at first. This is why when they come to our program, we don't teach them cognitive behavioral therapy right off the bat. We put them on what we call spa therapy at first. So we're doing exercise, we're doing nutrition, and by the way, nutrition is a vital role. I haven't, I didn't have enough, time slots necessarily to do nutrition in the brain and a lot of other things that I could have mentioned, but I just want to mention a little bit about the power that nutrition has in regards to helping us to be more emotionally intelligent. A few years ago, he used to be a board member of Weimar. His name is Terry Moreland. He's a prominent businessman in California. And he was the state of California was losing a lot of money in running their prisons. And so he put in a bid to run their prisons for them, or at least a number of their prisons. And he was awarded the contract to run a large number of prisons in California. And he was aware of some of what I talk about in the nutrition section of The Lost Art of Thinking, so you can get more information from that. But one of the things that in fact, this is what he changed almost immediately when he took over the prisons, is the prisoners were interviewed when they came into the prison by a nutritionist who taught them the power of diet and mental health. And they could then make a choice to be on the typical American prison diet, or to be on, it turns out, the best diet for mental health is a plant-based vegetarian diet. Now, some of the prisoners thought it was punishment enough to be in prison, but to be put on a plant-based diet would be cruel and unusual punishment. And so they said, no, sorry, I'm going to be on, I'm in prison, I at least want to eat the way I want to eat, and so I'm going to eat the typical American diet. And that was permitted. But others said, you know what, I'm in prison, I have nobody to impress. If this might work, let's give it a try. By the way, what percent of prisoners do you think chose the plant-based diet in America? 5%? 10%? 94% of the prisoners chose the plant-based diet. Now, what does that tell us? That told us that the nutritionist he hired to do this was a very good educator. If you have a good educator, you can take people that are even very resistant to change, even prisoners, and open their minds to the possibility of change. So 94% of them chose the plant-based diet. Now, within a few weeks, these prisoners would start talking about how much better they felt mentally. They were out of their brain fog. Things were, in fact, what they would talk about is, and hopefully very few of you have been to prison, but I can tell you that when you are in prison, there are very stressful things that happen in that prison. They actually funnel you around like cattle sometimes, and there's, your freedoms are given up when you go into those places. And so there's a lot of stress, and a lot of the stress is not caused by the security guards, it's caused by who? The other prisoners, which are significant issues. And so there's a lot of additional stress put on them. But when those very stressful situations occurred, they said, you know what? I was able to talk normally. I was able to talk without pressure. I didn't raise my voice. I was totally controlled. And the person actually listened to me. And then they would say this, I think if I were eating like this on the outside, I probably never would have ended up in here. Now, what Terry Moreland also did is when the prisoners got out, he looked at the recidivism rate. Now, I'll just tell you, in the United States, we have a problem with recidivism in our prison system. What does that mean? When they get out of prison, they're going right back into prison. In fact, there was just a news release just the other day of a man who'd been in prison for 20 years, and he was free for a total of 8 minutes. And so sometimes it's pretty quick, and they're going back in. Now, in America, we actually call these prisons correctional facilities. But obviously, we're not correcting a lot when you have very high recidivism rates. In California, the recidivism rate was about 80%. The best country in the world, in their prison system, has a recidivism rate of about 17%. Do you know which country that is? Anyone aware of the prison systems? It's actually Norway. So Norway has the lowest rates of recidivism in their prison system. In Terry Moreland's prison, guess what the recidivism rate was? 4%. Went down from 80% to 4%. Now, that tells you the power of good nutrition. And of course, it wasn't just a plant-based diet. As all of you know, you can be on a meatless diet that's very unhealthy. And so it was a healthy plant-based diet. But that's the power that nutrition can make. So this is what we're doing. We're changing their nutrition. We're changing their exercise. We're giving them natural shockwave treatments. You know what those natural shockwave treatments are? It's called contrast hydrotherapy. They get into a nice warm jacuzzi, you know, about, I don't have the conversion right because I still have Fahrenheit, but I think it's about 40 degrees Celsius, maybe 41 degrees Celsius. And we warm them up, and then we put them in a bath that has ice in it. And that's why we have to teach them that song, I don't like it, I don't like it, it's okay, I can stand it anyway. You know, by the end of the program, instead of them complaining about it, they want to rename the hydrotherapy center to the water park. They actually begin to like it, and a lot of those with severe mental illness. It's amazing what happens with that. It's far better than shockwave treatments. You don't lose your memory and those type of things. But that's part of the spa therapy, and of course there's a lot of other things. We're utilizing light therapy, early to bed, early to rise. And what we're doing is we're enhancing their frontal lobe, and then when the frontal lobe is enhanced, then we teach them distorted ways of thinking and how they can recognize it and correct their distorted thoughts. And that's when we can make a permanent cure as a result of this. So the benefits of cognitive behavioral therapy have been shown in controlled trials to be shown as at least as effective as drug therapy, has no physical side effects, makes relapse less likely than medicine, makes staying depression-free much more likely, and it actually changes brain chemistry for the better. Now, this is what we would call a reductionist study. Reductionist study is where you're just doing CBT. Why is our therapy far better than drug therapy? Because we're not doing just CBT. CBT on its own only improves about 53% of people. In other words, only 53% of people have a frontal lobe that's functional enough to even understand it and try to correct their thoughts. And so we're improving their frontal lobe first before we actually go through this. So what is it that makes your mood mad, glad, sad, or calm? It turns out we teach them the ABCs of CBT. The A is the activating event. And the C is the consequence. First there's an emotional consequence, then there's a behavioral consequence. Now that is actually not correct. The B is missing. But this is traditional psychotherapy. Traditional psychotherapy says you are the way you are simply due to the events that have happened in your life. And of course, your genetic makeup has a role to play. And actually, I probably need to say something about genetic makeup that I haven't said yet. We are having, there's an interesting, genetic flaws in other areas are increasing in our society. There's a geneticist that made several $1 billion in the United States. He formed 3 different genetic companies and was the genetic go-to guy in regards to extrapolating the entire DNA of humans. And then he did other nice things in genetics and was well thought of as probably one of the top, if not the top geneticists in the country, and made a lot of money through his knowledge and measurements of genes and extrapolation of the genetic code. After he made billions of dollars, and he sold those companies, that's how he made his billions, was by selling those companies, he decided to put some of that money into his own genetic research that he was interested in. And what he was interested in was looking at genetic mutations from one generation to another. And what he found out is if you are very healthy mother and father, you will not only pass along every mutation that you have to your children. I shouldn't say every, because you've been formed by two parents, so you're passing along half. You'll pass along half of your genetic mutations, and the mother will pass along, if you're the father, the mother will pass along half of her genetic mutations. But in addition, that infant will have 150 new mutations introduced that the mother and father does not have. If the mother and father are not very healthy, they'll pass along 300 mutations. So anywhere between 150 to 300 new mutations are introduced every generation. And since he knew the genetic code so well, he could recognize mutations versus the pure genetic code. And so after he found this out, generation after generation, studying them, multiple generations, he then said, let's extrapolate how many generations would we have to go back where there is no mutations whatsoever. Anyone want to guess how many generations back? 200 generations back, the genetic code was completely flawless. He said that's not a lot of generations. And for the first time in his life, he opened up the Bible and started to see if the Bible said anything about generations. And he found out by looking at the Bible and extrapolating back that that fit precisely about how far you'd have to go back to Adam and Eve. And then he went the other direction. If we continue with 150 to 300 mutations per generation, how many generations until the human race is extinct? By the way, in all of his research, he never found what's called upward mutations. Upward mutations is a theory that has never been proven, of which the entire evolutionary theory is based on. That we actually get better as a result of different, survival of the fittest, etc. So our genetic code will actually get better. He never found any upward mutations. But what he did find is something that's pretty startling. He says in 100 generations, if time lasts that long, in 100 generations, humanity will be extinct. They will not live long enough to be able to reproduce because of all of the disease that is introduced as a result of genetic mutations. Now, what he didn't know, and actually I was explaining this to a group of people in America the other day, and I just got an email from someone. I hadn't looked it up, but someone went to the Pen of Ellen White to look at this. And do you know what she says? She says, this was 100 years ago in her day, that if Adam and Eve had the genetic degeneration that you and I now have, the human race would have long ago become extinct. Actually, it's a pretty profound statement, and so they want me to send this to Dr. John Sanford. John Sanford, his book is called Genetic Entropy. Entropy means things become disorderly over time. It's one of those laws of physics. But he thought that this would dramatically change the worldview in regards to evolution. I mean, he was well thought of, a billionaire geneticist that knows genetics that well, and he was well respected. And so he thought this would be the equivalent of Darwin's theory of evolution now being turned on its head, and that the scientists everywhere would now realize that the Bible actually is substantiated. And so he wrote about this. He was excited about it, and he wrote the book called Genetic Entropy. And in the process of talking about it before he wrote the book, he realized something that startled him. He was now being excommunicated from the scientific community that he had become a major part of. And he realized that evolution was much more a religion than it was science. If you don't fit the evolutionary principles, you will actually be ostracized in many different scientific community circles. And so he actually, the other part of his book, talks about how evolution is much more of a religion than it actually is science. So just something to keep in mind in regards to genetics that are out there. We all have significant genetic flaws. In fact, Ellen White in that same statement says the genes were created so pure that it took about 2,000 years of degeneracy before it caught up to us in regards to the disease, because we had so many different barriers that were put against disease to begin with. And so we shouldn't be surprised with all the disease that's facing our world and with all of the different issues that actually are spurred on by genetics. Now, one of the other things that we talk about is how our genes can be turned off and on depending upon what we're eating and lifestyle factors. So we are not doomed by our genes. In fact, as I mentioned, you can have all 22 genes that have been identified as be associated with major depression and never experience it if you're on a good lifestyle. And so at this point in time, we can counteract that. Now, we may not be able to as generations continue to deteriorate as a result of genetic entropy. But nonetheless, let's go back to the ABCs. The activating event produces an emotional consequence. But it's not just A to C. Where I was at with that before I wanted to tell you some of the new information about genetic entropy is traditional psychotherapy just deals with people's past events in their life. And it rehashes it, and it goes over it, and it really spends a lot of time in regards to how you were raised and what happened when you were raised and how were you traumatized or mistreated by this individual or that. And it's kind of an unending process where you're having to deal with past activating events. Cognitive behavioral therapy spends some time on that because we want to know about the A's. But there's not a whole lot that we can do about your past A's. There is something, however, we can do about our present B's. By the way, Dr. Ellis, one of the founders of a type of cognitive behavioral therapy called rational emotive behavioral therapy, calls A to C thinking crooked thinking, believing that we have little or no ability to influence our feelings and that events and situations directly cause our emotions and behavior, is indeed crooked. By the way, there's a word in the Bible that's used extensively. The root word means bent or crooked. Do you know what it is? The root word for bent or crooked is translated iniquity in the Bible. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the psalmist said, the Lord will not hear me. Now, it's not because the Lord doesn't want to hear us. The Lord wants to influence us in a positive way, but unless we are willing to get rid of our crooked thoughts, he's not going to be able to influence us. And so that's what the psalmist is saying. If I have that iniquity, crooked thoughts, and by the way, iniquity sometimes is translated sin. Every sin committed starts out with a distorted thought first. And David made that clear in his Psalm of Repentance. This is a verse that's often not repeated in the Psalm. One of the verses that's repeated is a very good verse. Create in me a what type of heart, O God? Clean heart. But in that Psalm of deep heartfelt repentance, he says, Lord, thou desirest truth in the inward parts. He recognized that when he saw Bathsheba, if he would have thought true and accurate thoughts, he went into emotional reasoning, he went into magnification, he went into several distorted thoughts. And as a result of believing those distorted thoughts, he then committed the great sin. And so sin starts out first with a crooked thought. And that's why the psalmist is also saying, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord's not going to have influence over us. So this is a crucial aspect of being able to think clearly, is to get rid of crooked thoughts. So we have the activating event, then we have the belief, and then we have the emotional consequence. And so cognitive behavioral therapy centers a lot on the beliefs. Yes, we acknowledge the A, but we center in on the B's in response to the A's, and then we can dramatically change the C's in people's life. Their emotions and their behavior dramatically improves. Now, I talked about 4 different distortions on Friday evening, and I'm going to fill in some of the ones we didn't talk about here in the remaining time. One of them is called all or nothing thinking. An example of that is a patient who came to me, and he was a successful business person in our community. In fact, he was a state representative, and he was now, or a state senator. He was now running for a national position, the national representative for our area of Oklahoma. And he was part of the majority party. It was thought that because most people enroll in that party, and he was the candidate, that he was going to win. He lost the race for Congress, and he comes to me and he says, Dr. Nedley, I lost the race for Congress. I am a big 0. And I could tell by the look on his face, he believed what he was saying. Is that true? Because he lost the race for Congress, is he a big 0? No. Because you fail a test, does that mean you're a big 0? Because you get a divorce, does that mean you're a big 0? No, but that's where all or nothing thinking leads to. My friend doesn't agree with me on this issue, so he's completely non-supportive. That's a distortion. Jacob and Esau got into this. If you remember, the concern about who had the birthright. Who was born first? Esau. Esau was a tremendous hunter, and he loved being out in the field. And one day, he didn't do so well. He came back without a catch, and he hadn't eaten all day, and he was famished. And Jacob, who was more of a homebody, was out cooking his favorite meal in the field under an open fire. And Esau says, please, can I have some? And Jacob says, how bad do you want it? Esau says, what do you mean? He says, will you sell me my birthright for it? What did Esau say? He said something before he said yes. Do you remember what he said? If I don't eat this, I'm going to die, and you'll get the birthright anyway. And so I might as well live and you get the birthright than I die and you get the birthright. Now, was that a true statement? If he wasn't going to eat that, was he going to die? No, but he certainly felt that way. He believed the distorted all or nothing thought, and he ended up selling his birthright as a result of distorted all or nothing thinking. This is actually a distorted thought as well. A lot of people don't understand this, but this is all or nothing thinking. A person is either ugly or beautiful. You can show me whoever it is in the world that People magazine states is the most beautiful person this year, and I can guarantee that you would, if you look that person over, you'd be able to find something ugly about them. And you can also have someone who is thought to be the ugliest individual in the world, and I can tell you there's something beautiful about that person. So there is no such thing as being absolutely or all beautiful or all ugly. It's actually a distorted thought, but we tend to speak in these distortions. A person is either dumb or intelligent. I can tell you, you can take the most intelligent person in the world and they're going to be pretty dumb in some areas. And you can take someone who's thought to be a very low IQ individual, and they are going to know something a lot more than what you do in certain areas. And so that's really an all or nothing thought. Either you trust someone or you don't. Obviously, there are degrees of trust. I had an employee come to me a couple of years ago and said, Dr. Nedley, I think I found the problem. You just need to trust me. And I had to tell them that I did trust them. I trusted them to behave the way they've always behaved until they proved me otherwise. trust is something that you have to earn. That was a waste of time. A waste of time? You mean you didn't get anything out of it at all? And if you didn't get anything out of it, whose fault was it? I mean, you could have at least had some good 3x5 cards you got out, not related to that subject that you're trying to learn about, and do something that way. It's completely ruined. I had another employee tell me that about a year ago when her automobile was, quotes, totaled. And we did lend her our car until she could get a new one. But even though she said it was completely ruined, the insurance company sold it for quite a sum of money. And so again, not quite completely ruined. Watch out for this one. She is perfect. If you believe that, you're in for some significant emotional distress down the road. Now, results of all or nothing thinking, low self-worth will come about. Procrastination. Why do procrastinators think all or nothing thoughts? Their thought is, if I can't get it all done now, why even start? And so they don't work on it piece by piece to get it done. Results of all or nothing thinking interferes with goals. It inflates problems, resulting in frustration, pessimism, discouragement. And the ultimate all or nothing thought is actually suicidal thoughts. Now, very rarely, all or nothing thoughts can be true. For instance, a neuron either fires all the way or doesn't fire at all. One muscle fiber either contracts all the way or doesn't contract at all. But the best weightlifters in the world are not able to contract all of their bicep muscle fibers, 100% of them, at one time. If they did that, they would win the event by a long ways. The most they can do it is get about 80% of those fibers to contract all at once. And so, we have to differentiate. Sometimes all or nothing thoughts are true, but most of the time they are actually distorted. I'm going to skip to number 3. We covered overgeneralization, a very common one as well. But this one is called mental filter. Samson had a mental filter. He met a woman that was very enjoyable to be around. Their personalities just seemed to attract each other. And besides that, she was drop dead gorgeous. And so he says to his parents, "This is the one. Get her for me. She pleaseth me well." The parents tried to give him some cognitive behavioral therapy and says, "Wait a minute, what about this? What about that? What about this?" And Samson said, "None of that matters. We just enjoy each other so much that everything's going to fall into line. Don't worry, she's the one." How long did that last? The good part of that marriage lasted a week. It took a year before the divorce actually occurred. But it all got as a result, it came about as a result of mental filter, only looking at one side of the equation. Joseph was tempted to have a mental filter in regards to his brothers, and he had a lot of evidence to have this mental filter. Joseph suffered from a condition that we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's very clear that it would replay in his mind like a movie. He could actually smell the smells of the pit. He could hear the voices of his brothers. In fact, he knew who said what, when. It all played back like a movie, and it would play back periodically, and particularly in prison, it started to rev up. How did he counteract that mental filter that he had, which was actually based on a true movie, things that had happened in his life? I'll tell you the secret here in a little bit. But first I want to tell you about a man that came to us recently. He told me, "There's nothing good in my life." I said, "Really? What's going on?" "My job stinks. I hate it. My wife is continually nagging. My roof has started to leak. The bills are piling up. In fact, I had to actually go into debt on my credit card to come to this depression recovery program. In addition, my boss yells at me almost constantly. I'm short and fat, and furthermore, I'm going bald. Nothing good in my life. But as I started to talk to him, I realized that he enjoyed his children. He did have close friends. His wife, even though she nags, is very attractive. He is still able to sleep well. He can actually still feed himself. He has no difficulty breathing. And even though he's short and fat, he can still walk well. In addition, he actually enjoyed his church, and he had the potential to do a lot of good things. But here he is on one side of the equation, nothing good in my life. So what is the solution to a mental filter? You must intentionally, forcefully look for evidence that supports a different way of thinking. And it does have to be intentional and forceful. Did Joseph do this? He was intentional and forceful to try to look for evidence that supported a different way of thinking about his brothers. Did he find that way? He actually did. And when he did, that's when he revealed himself to him. Now, it took him some time. Sometimes it'll take some time to get rid of the mental filter and to be intentional and forceful to look for evidence to support a different way of thinking. But after the time that it took, it was well worth the effort. And he revealed himself, and his brothers thought, uh-oh, we're dead men, because they knew what he would think about them. But yet, instead of him just thinking that about them, he thought far differently about them now, because he was intentional and forceful to look for evidence that supported a different way of thinking. The fourth one is even worse. It appears to be objective, where you acknowledge the other side, but then you totally discount it. And it can be rather significant at times. I remember one time I was called to our behavioral medicine unit for a nutritional consult. We actually have psychiatrists that utilize me a lot for nutrition and lifestyle things in our community. So I had interviewed the girl the evening before. She was in the psych institution, and then next morning I came by and was talking to her, and she says, Dr. Nedley, nobody cares a thing about me. Now, she didn't use the term a thing, she used a curse word, but nobody cares a thing about me. And I said, that's not true. I wouldn't be here if I didn't care about you. And I said, furthermore, I've seen the staff. They've said some positive things about you. They've demonstrated that they care about you. Do you know what she said? Those people don't count, Dr. Nedley, because they're not part of the real world. Anyone who's part of the real world does not care anything about me. And then I thought, the evening before, I saw some family there visiting her. I had seen some other patients in her room, and they were cutting up with her and having a good time when I walked in. And I reminded her about that. And she said, those people don't count, Dr. Nedley, because they don't know the real me. Anyone who knows the real me recognizes I'm rotten to the core, can't think anything positive about me. Now, at that point, of course, and it is true, apart from the power of God in our life, we can be pretty rotten individuals. But for her to discount, she was going beyond that. She was disqualifying any positive. I called up the psychiatrist and I said, I don't think she's ready for discharge. She told me she was going to go home later that day. So I told him what happened, and he kept her and did had her go through some cognitive behavioral therapy. But disqualifying the positive also is the distortion that gets in the way of us achieving our goals. It sounds rewarding, but I know there are so many struggles accompanying those that try to learn how to put on a depression recovery program in their communities that I will be absolutely overwhelmed. There it is, you're acknowledging the positive. It sounds rewarding, but then you totally discount it because it's going to be too much. The solution to this, Hannah More and others talk about it. She says, obstacles are those frightful things you see when you take your eyes off your goal. Henry Ford says, think you can, think you can't. Either way, you'll be right. Refusing to disqualify the positive. Thomas Fuller says, he does not believe who does not live according to his belief. And by the way, that is a true statement. You might think, well, wait a minute, there's times when I haven't lived according to my belief, but that's because you've had, at that time, you believed a competing belief more than you believe what you state you believe. And so if you're not living according to your belief, you need to elevate what your competing belief is and actually see which one is true, and you need to act on the true one. But you were probably acting on a very distorted belief that you believed more of at that point in time. Anne Frank says, I don't think of all the misery, but of the beauty that still remains. Refusing to disqualify the positive. Lee Salk says, when it gets dark enough, you can see the stars. Refusing to disqualify the positive. David Schwartz says, we can turn setbacks into victories, find the lesson, apply it, and move on, then look back on defeat and smile. And Abraham Lincoln says, determine that the thing can and shall be done, and then we shall find the way. Refusing to disqualify the positive. The next distortion I want to bring up by having you take a little section of an emotional intelligence test. Now before, there's going to be 4 questions. If you have pens, maybe you can write down the answers, see how you do on this EQ test. But before you take the test, I want to tell you a couple of things. Don't get upset at me because I did not create this test. This is part of a standardized emotional intelligence test. Also, if you don't do well in this section, recognize that there are 4 other aspects of emotional intelligence that you might do very well on. So, and then the other thing you need to recognize is emotional intelligence can be improved upon. So don't think this is, necessarily reflecting bad on you if you don't do well on this test. But hopefully you can see the people here on the screen. Now I don't see them. Let's see, where is the screen? There it is. I'm going to see, I think you can see their expressions pretty well there. There's 3 people we're going to be talking about in this. 3 of the questions have to do with 3 people. 2 questions has to do with one person. But notice first the girl in pink who's kind of looking up with her hands crossed like this. This is Ellen. What do you think she is most likely thinking at the time this picture was taken? And the answers can go all the way from A to G. Bored, hopeful, stressed, terrified, shocked, cannot be determined, none of the above, or don't know. What do you think Ellen is most likely thinking at the time this picture was taken? Now, of course, part of emotional intelligence is recognizing emotions in others. And that's why it's part of an EQ test. All right, you ready for us to move on? The next one is the girl in red in the front who has her arm up. Her name is Stacy. What do you think she is most likely thinking at the time this picture was taken? Disgusted, excited, sad, happy, neutral, cannot be determined, none of the above, or don't know? The third one is going to be the boy in the back. Are you ready? First, Stacy, disgusted, excited, sad, happy, neutral, cannot be determined, none of the above, or don't know. The next one is the boy in the back who kind of has a little, I don't know what you would call that expression. Maybe I shouldn't say what it is. But what do you think Steve is most likely thinking at the time this picture was taken? Neutral, sad, amused, curious, joyful, cannot be determined, none of the above, or don't know. And now finally, one last question. Imagine that Ellen is the girl in pink with her hands folded, the first one that you did. Imagine that Ellen is returning from a visit with her boyfriend who has unexpectedly broken up with her. Knowing this and seeing her expression, she most likely feels which one of the following emotions? Sad, furious, neutral, relieved, suspicious, cannot be determined, none of the above, or don't know. All right, are you ready for the answers? You get 4 points for each one of these questions, so it's a total of 16 points, so you can see how you did. But if you, all 4 of them are rated the same as far as the letters. If you answered A, B, or C on any of them, you got 0 points for that question. If you answered D, you got 1 point. That was the secondary emotion. If you answered E, you got 2 points. If you answered F, you got 3 points. And if you answered G, you got 4 points. Now, what was happening in regards to those of you that did not do so well? You were actually participating in a cognitive distortion called mind reading. Now, mind reading is one of those cognitive distortions that's been actually studied. There's a great book called Everyday Mind Reading, Understanding What People Think and Feel, and it turns out you'll only be right 1 out of 4 times in strangers or those you don't know well. Did you know any of those people? No. So you only had a 1 in 4 chance to actually be right about them when you looked at them. Now, you were, of course, thinking if you had that expression, maybe what you would be feeling. But again, every individual is somewhat different. Now, the other amazing thing about mind reading is they've compared genders, women and men. Who do you think are actually better at it? Well, the studies are pretty clear. They're equal in their ability to read the minds of others. And then they've looked at people who you know very well. For instance, if you have a loving spouse that you've lived with for 20 years, are you better at mind reading him than a stranger? You actually are. Yeah, you're pretty good at it. But, whoops, I didn't mention it on here. Let's see. Well, I'll just tell you, it somehow didn't get on there. You're 80% accurate in those that you know very well. But that's not 100%. And if you assume that you can read the mind of your spouse 100% of the time, you're going to have some emotional problems as a result of that. Now, one of the cognitive distortions that tends to come up frequently, particularly in societies, is indeed this mind reading. You know, one of the things, we're here in South Africa, and so there's often we will have people labeled with thoughts that they do not have and actually mind reading them. And one of those things is when we label someone as a racist. To label someone as a racist, we actually have to say that we understand their thoughts. And what I've had to tell individuals, or just have to ask them, have you ever been mistreated by someone of your own race but didn't know why? Any of you ever been mistreated by someone of your own race and didn't know why? All right, I do see some hands go up and some heads nodding. Now, of course, if they weren't a member of your own race, you might be tempted to think they're treating you that way because of racism. But since they're the member of your own race, you didn't think that. You just didn't know why you were being mistreated. And so to actually label someone because they do certain things as that way, it may not be their motive at all. There may be other things that are related to that. And so what happens when we label someone with thoughts that they do not have, then what happens to that individual is they are going to tend to emotionally reason with that individual because they have been falsely accused, and then to lash out as a result of emotional reasoning, and then tensions come about simply due to cognitive distortions. And that's exactly what happened in America in a very prominent event that happened when a Harvard professor who was African American, was returning home from an international speaking tour, something I'm going to be doing pretty soon, and he forgot his keys to his house. So in order to get into his home, it was night, he broke in to his own house to get in. He was being visualized from the rear as he was going through the window. And a driver-by called the police and said, someone is breaking in to such and such a house at such and such an address. The policeman then came to that house and knocked on the door and interviewed the professor, and the professor was outraged that a policeman was there when he had broken into his own house, and labeled the policeman a racist, and you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for race. Of course, they played back the tape, and the woman didn't even see the race because they just saw the back of his head. And so there was nothing about race that was mentioned. The policeman knew he wasn't there due to racism, and so he underwent emotional reasoning and getting angry at being falsely accused, and he ended up handcuffing the professor and taking him to jail. Well, it turned out the professor was personal friends with Barack Obama. And so the next day, Barack Obama gets a call in regards to how mistreated he was in regards to this. And of course, they brought in the person who had reported it, and they found out that there wasn't race involved in it. But the solution that our president had for the situation was to bring both individuals to the White House and and have them participate in a drink to suppress their frontal lobe so they could all get along. And it was interesting, the woman who had reported it, she wasn't invited to the White House, and she says, it's curious to me that the solution is alcohol for this problem. The solution to the problem was actually getting rid of the distorted thoughts of each one of those individuals. And mind reading on one, emotional reasoning on another, and also magnification. And so we need to be careful. A lot of times problems in churches and problems in other places are simply due to jumping to conclusions in regards to what people are thinking. And there are two main distortions that we tend to do in jumping to conclusions. And you know, the human nature part of jumping to conclusions is it's actually easier than gathering the facts. Stephen Wright says a conclusion is what you come to when you're tired of thinking about something. And you know, sometimes it's okay not to come to a conclusion. Then when we have mind reading, we tend to do also fortune teller error as part of it. I mentioned this in regards to Michaela, but there are other fortune teller errors. I know he won't do it because he'll think it's too hard. It's one of the reasons why cardiologists don't always explain a plant-based diet to a patient, because they think there's no way he's going to do this, so why even bother with it? But you know, that's a paternalistic attitude. And often there's a lot more people interested in following a diet like that if they knew the benefits than many cardiologists might believe. And so they get into fortune teller error on this patient. And sometimes the fortune teller error is on themselves. I will never be able to overcome this problem. Abraham got into both mind reading and fortune teller error. He knew that when his wife was visualized by the king of Egypt, that he was a dead man. Now, one of the things he was actually accurate on in regards to mind reading the king was the fact that when the king viewed Sarah, that he would be attracted to her. And you know, at this time, Sarah was over, 70 years old? So, I mean, she had to be a very attractive woman, over 70, and having this young king totally enthralled with her when he saw her. So Abraham was not like, well, I shouldn't say this. Just let me say that Abraham was actually not just biased in regards to the appearance of his wife. And so he knew how others reacted when they were around her. So he was truthful about that in regards to mind reading the king. But it was actually he actually was distorted in his mind reading of the king of thinking that he'd be a dead man. In fact, had he told the king the truth that Sarah was his wife, the king would have never been interested in Sarah. And then, on top of that, to say that he's not only going to be interested, but he's going to take my life. When the king found out that that's why Abraham hadn't been truthful with him, the king was outraged in regards to how Abraham had been mind reading him. And had it not been for the intervention of the Lord, Abraham would have been wiped out due to the fact that he mind read the king. And so Abraham was told to leave Egypt and get out of there. And so we need to be careful in regards to mind reading others. Often we can, of course, judge their behavior and what they're doing, but we don't always know the motives behind that. And sometimes, of course, when you understand human nature, you can understand the probable motives, but sometimes it's okay to ask. Why? What were you thinking? Let people actually talk about these things. Emotional reasoning, I don't feel like changing anything right now, so I won't, and so that gets in the way of lifestyle change a lot. Mislabeling is another one. This is where we label people with names that are not quite accurate, and then those names get about, and people find out that we were labeled that way, and so we label the labeler with another name that isn't quite accurate. And around this goes. And then we can mislabel definitions. These are definitions that I've heard that are actually fit mislabeling or irrational definitions. A person is lazy if she doesn't wash the dishes after she eats. Is that what the dictionary definition of lazy is? It's not. And there may be times when a person who's not lazy at all may not wash the dishes immediately after she eats. Now, if it happens all the time, then it makes it more likely that there is some laziness around. If a woman cares about me, she will do this for me every day. Really? That's the definition of care? If a man doesn't spend all his time with me, he is selfish. The definition of selfishness. And so these mislabels can cause a lot of issues. Well, that's touching on some of the distortions, but in wrapping things up, cognitive behavioral therapy wasn't just discovered by Dr. Beck and Dr. Ellis. The Bible talks about it. Paul says, whatsoever things are what? True. Whatsoever things are honest. Whatsoever things are just. It's kind of interesting. Those are the first three things that are mentioned. If there be any virtue and if there be any praise, do what? Think on these things. Cognitive behavioral therapy is not new. The Bible knew about this as well and knew the critical importance of true and accurate thoughts. There are some spiritual aspects to emotional intelligence. There are three primary spiritual aspects to emotional intelligence. And by the way, someone asked me today, who was driving me to an appointment, your program is very Christian-based. Do you ever have people that are non-Christians come to your program? And the answer is, oh yes, we have them. We have atheists come to our programs. We have Buddhists. We have Hindus. Last program we had a Hindu. And they know that it's going to be spiritually based. And often, I'll tell you, one of the first atheists that came to our program, I remember somehow she didn't see, because we advertise it as a spiritually based Christian program, but somehow I think the Lord might have hid that from her. And so she realized on that first night, okay, there's going to be morning and evening frontal lobe sessions, devotional sessions. And so she says, I'm an atheist. I just want you to know that, and I'm not planning on attending the morning and evening devotionals. And I said, how firm a believer are you in your atheism? And she says, I am a staunch atheist. I am not going to change my belief. I said, well, then you have nothing to fear by coming to the program. The devotions in the morning and the evening. I'm not going to ask you to agree with everything, but agree with what you can agree with, because we are going to have spiritual principles. And then apply what you agree with, and then see what happens. This is part of your recovery as well. And so she agreed, okay, I'll do this. And the three primary things that we mention in our devotional aspects is truth. That means accuracy in thought, not distorted. So truth is a spiritual principle. The other one we speak a lot about is love. Altruistic love is what the medical literature calls it. The Bible calls it agape love, self-sacrificing, principled love. And the third one is freedom. These are all spiritual principles, where you're not a slave to anything, including an addiction or non-addiction. You're not coercive to others. You want to have influence over others in a positive way, but not coercive. And comprehensive self-control. When you have comprehensive self-control, that is true freedom. At the end of the program at her last visit, she says, Dr. Nedley, I believe in truth. I believe in love. And I believe in freedom. And she says, I want to learn more about those principles and encompass them in my life. So she says, what I've decided is I have figured out that you are a Seventh-day Adventist. So when I go home to Toronto, I'm going to attend the local Seventh-day Adventist church to learn more about those three principles. Now, she wasn't willing to say that she had changed her beliefs per se, but a lot of times people are atheists simply because they have been taught false things about God. Sometimes I'll ask them, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And of course they believe that God is coercive and punishes unjustly and does all of those sorts of things, and I don't believe in a God that way either. But yet atheists, we'll have it come up on our website. The last atheist who attended just recently wanted to even put a video up on the program to encourage atheists to attend. So despite the overtly spiritual interest that is there, no matter what faith they come from, it's having a very positive aspect in regards to their frontal lobe and opening them up for improvement. The last step on cognitive behavioral therapy is practice, practice, practice. Realistic thinking does not come naturally to us human beings, particularly when we have all those mutations going on in our brain. By the way, if you had no mutations in your brain, you would never have to write anything down that I'm saying. That's why the first 2,000 years there was no written stuff. People remembered exactly what Adam said, and when he passed it down, they remembered. They had photographic memories. So that's how the genes were originally in regards to the brain. So we all have flawed brains. We have flawed memories, and we have flawed ways of distorted thinking, but we can actually discipline ourselves to think true and accurate thoughts. It must be a conscious choice followed by strong effort. The more balanced feelings that will result will be worth the struggle and the effort. And that requires, of course, changes in the way we think and changes in our behavior. There's four main stages of change. The first one is unconsciously incompetent. Most people that think distorted thoughts have no idea that their thoughts are distorted. They think they're thinking completely true and accurate thoughts. That's one of the difficulties of talking to a large audience like this, because we're talking about individuals that had distorted thoughts, and you're thinking, oh, I don't have that thought, I must be pretty good. But in reality, you might have some significant distortions that you don't know about that are hurting you. And so you can be unconsciously incompetent. But once you learn distortions and recognize that you have them, you now become consciously incompetent. That you're incompetent, but now you know you are. And that's a step in the right direction. That requires good truth and knowledge to understand that. But then to actually think the true and accurate thought, write it down and start thinking it habitually, that's when you are consciously competent. And that takes some effort. I'll just give another example in regards to lifestyle change, going through these same principles. One of the first clinical psychologists that we utilized in our program, she was a very good cognitive behavioral therapist, but she wasn't up to date on all the lifestyle measures. And so she listened to my talk on caffeine. And she realized I'm having heartburn, I'm having indigestion, and I do have some irritableness with my husband that I don't like. It's an issue. I'm going to give this up. Now, prior to her giving this up, the only beverage that she thought about when she got thirsty was Pepsi. And so when she became consciously incompetent and learned the disadvantages of caffeine, and then when she finally decided to put it into action, to have conscious competence, when she got thirsty then, what do you think she thought of? No, she still thought of Pepsi. She said, no, not Pepsi, I'm going to drink water. That's why it was conscious competence. Do you know how long it took before she went to stage 4? Stage 4 is when you become unconsciously competent. That's when you're benefiting from the good. It's no longer a struggle. It's part of your life. You're not going to go back to the other way. It took 30 days. But at day 30, she recognized, when I'm thirsty, I'm not having to think Pepsi. No, not Pepsi, water. Water is what I'm thinking about. And for every habit, it takes a period of time before we get to unconscious competence. But that's when the psalmist says, at thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. You know, doing the will of the Lord is indeed a pleasure. To do thy law is a delight. And a lot of people see people that have the delight in doing the law of the Lord, and they're unconsciously incompetent, and they're wondering, how can this person be so happy in this existence? And then those that are doing the law of the Lord are looking people that are unconsciously incompetent and thinking, what a fool for being happy over doing something that's going to cave them in the end. But we're all on different stages in regards to lifestyle change. One of the other founding fathers of our country says this: truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains taken to bring it to light. And often there are pains. Sometimes we have to peel back the onion, and we get to the pain of revealing the truth and the distorted thought to the individual, and then them having to face up to it and correct that distorted thought. The Bible says, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Ancient evidence for the power of thought. And as we close here at camp meeting, I will read the words of Christ himself. Remember, emotional intelligence, it can be improved upon. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, we thank you that we have the ability to analyze our thoughts. We have the ability to look for distortions in those thoughts. And we have the ability, through your grace and power, to be transformed through the renewing of our mind. I pray that each one here might pray the prayer of David: search me, try me, know my thoughts, see if there's any distorted way, and point it out to me in some way or fashion so that I can correct that thought and be more successful in my walk with you. We thank you for hearing and answering this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.